So I wanted to take a couple of minutes today and talk about just reading your Bible and what does that look like? What are the steps that I take when I'm reading my Bible to make sure that what I'm understanding is what I should be understanding? Because the Bible, it wasn't written to me. It wasn't written for us in the 21st century. And that's something we have to understand, like right off the bat, when it comes to reading our Bible and understanding what's happening in here and figuring out what is applicable to today, what's applicable to our lives. You have to know this wasn't written for you. It's a collection of different books and poetry and letters and stories all put together that were each written for different people at different times in history. And so there's this framework that I learned in college and I've used over the past few years that has helped me to understand the Bible and to be able to walk through different parts of the Bible and be able to understand them correctly and be able to understand the parts that may seem weird. And then it helps keep me from reading the Bible and only hearing what I wanted to hear. I'm not only hearing my own opinions, but I'm hearing what it's really supposed to be saying. And so the framework is this. We live in the society that we're in. We live in a town that's situated over here. But the people that these different books and letters and poems and stories were written for, they live in a completely different world with completely different set of circumstances that's way over here. And so our job, in order to understand these different books and things that were written for people that live in this town, we have to understand their town. We have to understand their culture. We have to understand their history. And then when we understand what's happening in their town, we can look at the distance between their town and our town and say, okay, this is the difference. This is the distance between the two of us. What's the common thing that's connecting these two? I had a professor who worded it as, what's that core kernel of truth that's underneath all of that? Underneath all of the culture and the history, what's that core piece, that core value that the passage that you're looking at is communicating to this town? What's that core piece? Is it a piece about the way that God's love works? Is it a piece about the way that God can give peace? What is that core foundation that it's communicating to these people? And once you know that, then you can come over to your town and to the place that you live in the society and the culture and the time period that you live in, and you can apply that core piece that was communicated to this town over to you. So the way it plays out is, say you come to a passage, so like let's just open it up. So let's do like Acts chapter 2. And I'm going to dive into this more next week. But say you come to a passage in Acts chapter 2 and you're wanting to understand like what's happening. So you read the passage and you hear all the stuff that's taking place. But if you want to understand like what is this, actually Acts chapter 2 isn't a good example. Let's do, let me find it for you guys. Actually, hold on. Let me find it. I'll be back. Okay, so the passage that I want us to take a look at is in the book of Ephesians. And so before we dive into that, though, I want us to know that the book of Ephesians, it isn't a book as we understand a book, but it's a letter. It's a letter written by a dude named Paul to a church in a city called Ephesus. So this pastor, this church planter, this missionary is writing this letter to this church and talking to them about a host of different things. But what we're going to look at is the relationships that we have inside of a household, and he's going to be talking to them about that. So in Ephesians chapter 5, we're going to start in verse 22, just for a couple verses that we're going to take a look at. But just as a side note, the chapters and verses that we have in our Bible, like chapter 5 and verse 22, those weren't original. Like when Paul was writing his letter, he didn't put numbers in between his different sentences. He wrote it like a letter. But later on in history, we added these things to help us be able to know what we're talking about whenever we're reading through the Bible. Anyways, so chapter 5, verse 22, Paul, writing to this church in Ephesus, says, "Wives, be subject to your husbands as you are to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, just as Christ is the head of the church, the body of which he is the Savior. Just as the church is subject to Christ, so also wives ought to be in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, in order to make her holy by cleansing her with the washing of water by the word, so as to present the church to himself in splendor and without a spot or wrinkle or anything of the kind, yes, so that she may be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as they do their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hates his own body, but he nourishes and tenderly cares for it, just as Christ does for the church." Jumping down to chapter 6 and verse 1, it continues in the relationships that you have in your house. And Paul says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, so that you may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. And fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in discipline and instruction of the Lord. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling and singleness of heart as you obey Christ, not only while being watched and in order to please them, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Render service with enthusiasm as to the Lord, not to men and women, knowing that whatever good we do, we will receive the same again from the Lord, whether we are slaves or free. And masters, do the same to them. Stop threatening them, for you know that both of you have the same master in heaven, and with him there is no partiality." So, you read that straightforward, and it's easy to come to the Bible with your own presumptions. We do it automatically just out of how our brains are wired. When we're reading this text, we're going to interpret it through the own lens of our own cultural experiences, through our own experiences with church, through our own experiences in society. And so if you come from a more traditional outlook on Christianity, on the Bible, on relationships between men and women, when you read that, you're going to see, oh, men are above women, kids listen to your parents, slaves listen to your masters, and that's what you're going to say that those verses are about. And that is a logical conclusion when you come to the Bible with those presumptions. But in order for us to treat this well, in order for us to do this right, we have to understand what's happening in Ephesus, what's happening in that culture. And so what we know about what was happening is that everybody in that time period, in the first century, in these regions, they knew that women needed to respect their husbands. They knew that kids needed to respect their parents. They knew slaves needed to respect their masters. That was common knowledge, and that was widely accepted. But those secondary statements that Paul makes, whenever he says, okay, but husbands, you need to love your wives. Fathers, you cannot anger your kids, or like the way you're treating them, you need to watch how you're doing that. Masters, you need to make sure that you're treating your slaves well, because you know that with God, there is no partiality between human beings. Those statements in and of themselves were countercultural to the society that the church in Ephesus found themselves in. Those were shocking and radical statements. And so if we know that, one statement is commonplace and easily understood, but then Paul's making a point to put in these crazy statements that nobody else would have agreed with. When we know that, when we read those verses, we go, oh, the point Paul is trying to make isn't, hey, husbands, you're above your wives. What he's really trying to say is, hey, you understand there's a level of respect this direction in your relationship. But what you guys need to know and what you guys need to understand is that relationship goes the other way as well. There's a mutual level of respect. There's a mutual level of love, that men and women are equal, that kids and parents both need to respect one another. They both need to love one another. They both need to care for one another. That it isn't this one-sided power dynamic where the powerful outweigh those that are underneath them, those that are marginalized. And knowing that, then we see what Paul is saying of, hey, when you're in a relationship and there's a power dynamic, what we need to understand is that power dynamic has to be equal. That equality is a central piece of a Christian understanding of relationships, that respect works both directions. And so we take that core truth. Paul was communicating it to the church in Ephesus by saying, here's what you know, here's a radical statement. And that's how he was communicating that core truth. But then now that we know that core truth, we can come to today's society and say, okay, how can I apply this concept of equality in relationships to my life? And that's where the power of the Bible can come in, the power of God's truth comes in. When we understand what was really being communicated, what was God really communicating through these situations to the culture that it was being communicated in. Oh, that was the truth? That was the meaning? Sweet. Now let's take that core piece and now let's apply it to our lives. And if you walk through that process of taking something and walking through how to understand it. So like another example is in Leviticus, which is this book in the Old Testament, which is the first half of our Bibles, there's this passage where it talks about how the Israelites weren't allowed to boil a kid, a baby goat, in its mother's milk. Seems really strange if you try and take that and apply it to today's society. But if we go back and we try and understand why is that in there? Why would they have been saying those things? Okay, so we can look at that situation and we can say, well, there were other religions that were in that area. There were other religions that were around the Israelites that when you boiled a goat in its mother's milk, it was a part of a ritualistic sacrifice. It was a part of this ritual that was serving and honoring these other gods. And so when God says to the Israelites, hey, you shouldn't be doing that, what he's saying is, hey, you shouldn't be a part of something that's honoring these other deities because you're in a relationship with me. You should be honoring the relationship that we have together. So that's a concept that we can take and apply to today's lives. We can't necessarily apply, oh, I can't boil a kid in its mother's milk. Like, that doesn't apply to my life. But what I can apply to my life is, I don't want to be a part of things that are glorifying something that's putting itself above God. I want to make sure that my relationship with God is my priority, that it is above everything else in my life. That's a principle that God is communicating to the Israelites by saying, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. But it's a principle that God is saying to me through that story as an illustration that I can then take and apply to my life. And I think if you take the time and walk through that process, then anything you come to in the Bible, you can understand, how does this apply to my life? Is this a part of the Bible that still applies? Do I still have to not boil a kid in its mother's milk? Well, no, that doesn't apply anymore because we understand what's the real heart behind it. And if we understand the real heart behind it, then everything in the Bible becomes really easy to understand and really easy to apply to our own lives. So on Thursdays when we do our Bible studies together, I'm going to try and follow that format with you guys. We're going to walk through a couple different stories that I'm passionate about, that are meaningful to me. And if you guys like it, I'd love to hear from you guys. If you have a story or a Bible passage that you want me to talk about, that you want us to walk through together, please let me know down in the comments. There's no Bible passage that is too hard or too difficult or too weird. Like, I'd love to spend time researching and talking about it with you guys. So please let me know. If you like these videos, it makes a big deal and a big difference if you guys would like this video, if you would subscribe and hit the bell in the corner for notifications. It helps us be able to communicate and hang out with more of you guys. So thank you so much for listening to me talk about this. As I said, if you like it, I'll be doing these every single Thursday. I'm really looking forward to spending this time with you guys. So thanks so much, and we will see you guys tomorrow.